It was late at night in a federal women's prison in California. The lights were off, but in cell block Delta, darkness took on a different meaning. Behind the steel bars, a woman named Maria lay awake, heart racing. She wasn't asleep because of fear of the other inmates, but because of the guard just down the corridor, whose footsteps echoed like a predator creeping through shadows. She'd heard rumors. She'd seen the signs. Guards visiting that block too often, smiling when no one else could see. She didn't dare call for help. This was FCI Dublin, once a low-security facility, but in those years it had bristled with a far more sinister energy. Over time, a scandal erupted. Chaplains, officers, even the warden himself, were under investigation for abusing female inmates. In reality, the prison had become a place where the ones meant to guard were the very ones praying inside the walls. Beyond the watchful eye, Maria wasn't alone. Across the U.S., scores of incarcerated women have told stories chillingly similar. According to a seminal Human Rights Watch report titled All Too Familiar, male correctional officers have sexually assaulted, raped, and abused female prisoners using their authority to dominate, coerce, and silence them. There were cases of vaginal, anal, and oral rape, unwanted groping during so-called pat frisk searches, and verbal harassment that filled the air like poison. Yet these stories rarely made headlines. Many women hesitated to speak out. Every complaint risked retaliation, isolation, or worse. Grievance systems in prisons were often broken or meaningless, while abusers walked free in uniform, protected by the very system they perverted. But it wasn't just an American problem. Across Europe, research found parallel horrors. In a comprehensive study of women's prisons around the continent, scholars noted that female inmates often suffer from unaddressed mental health issues, prior histories of trauma, and inadequate medical care behind bars. In addition, policymakers admitted that prisons are calibrated for men leaving pregnant inmates, mothers, and trauma survivors without proper support. European Parliament. One former prisoner, known only as Evelyn in her accounts, described being forced to live in close quarters with an inmate assigned to her unit who was male, despite identifying as a woman. The psychological and physical toll was devastating. Threats, manipulation, aggression, all masked by the promise of rights under misused gender policies. Back in Ireland's Dublin facility, the case finally broke wide open. A scandal triggered by brave inmates resulted in multiple correctional officials being charged. The former warden and a prison chaplain were convicted. The warden received a significant prison sentence. But for many survivors like Maria, justice felt delayed and cold. Their suffering had happened in the dark, and even after the trials, few outside understood what they had endured. What makes this all so sinister is how normal it all seems once you're inside. The culture in women's prisons often allows the same power imbalances and exploitation that trapped these women outside to follow them in. Many incarcerated women carry histories of abuse. 60% to 80% report prior sexual or domestic violence. When they enter prison, they don't walk into rehabilitation. Too often, they step right into a cage built by similar predators, but with bars they cannot break. Take Edna Mahan Correctional Facility in New Jersey. A Department of Justice report described the open secret of sexual misconduct for years: officers abusing inmates, leveraging power, manipulating silence. Meanwhile, countless women in state prisons across the U.S. tell the same story. Male guards outnumber female staff, and complaints rarely go anywhere. These abuses are not just isolated incidents, they're woven into the system. The very design of many prisons doesn't protect women. Grievance procedures fail, oversight is weak, and for every woman who speaks out, there are others who still suffer in silence. For Maria, what started as a whisper in the dark grew into a quiet resistance. She began recording everything: late-night conversations she overheard, doors that opened when they shouldn't, the way the guard's voice changed when he thought no one was listening. She stored her notes secretly, in the cracks of her bunk frame. One night, she finally slipped a paper through the bars, addressed to a lawyer she trusted on the outside. But what she didn't know was that she wasn't the only one quietly building a case. A small collective of women in that block had begun to talk, to map out their experiences, to connect the dots. And then late that same week, Maria and her allies got a quiet knock on the door. It was a woman in a plain suit, not a guard. She carried a folder. "I want to talk to you," she said, her tone low, almost kind. In her hands was evidence, reports from other inmates, records of complaints, and legal documents. But the biggest shock came when Maria flipped open the folder to see photographs, discrete snapshots of that same guard, taken by other women. Evidence of unwanted touching, patterns of movement inside the prison. The file went deeper than anything she'd recorded. There was a chilling line in his employment file, buried under layers of bureaucracy. A warning from years ago. A complaint had been filed, dismissed, insufficient evidence. And yet here he was, still walking those halls at night, still keeping the women in his shadow. As Maria looked up, the woman in the suit closed the folder. There was fear in her eyes, but something stronger to determination. "You're not alone," she said, "and we can't let this continue." But just as relief began to flicker through Maria's chest, the door to her cell block slammed shut. The guard's footsteps returned, echoing, but this time she knew someone was watching him back. And in the darkness of that cell, she understood the horrifying truth. They had opened a door, but what they found inside would change everything. The room in which Maria met the woman in the plain suit felt like a war room. She sat at a small plastic table under cold fluorescent lights. Across from her was her unexpected ally Sophie, an investigator from a non-profit watchdog group. Sophie's folder lay open, spilling over with carefully organized testimony, names, dates, and photographs, the skeleton of a legal case. Sophie leaned in, voice low, almost urgent. "What you have here isn't just isolated incidents. This is systemic," she said. The tremor in her tone made Maria's heart pound. This wasn't just about her guard anymore. Sophie explained how they had quietly gathered statements from nearly a dozen other women in Maria's cell block, each one too afraid to speak out until now. These weren't petty complaints. They were detailed, horrifying accounts of abuse, nighttime visits, mandatory pat-downs that went too far, officers offering contraband or better treatment in exchange for sexual favors. According to a report by Human Rights Watch titled "All Too Familiar Male Correctional Officers in U.S. State Prisons Had Been Documented Raping Female Prisoners vaginally, anally, and orally, using their power to force compliance, reward prisoners, or punish them." Their report revealed how these officers used room searches and pat frisks to grope incarcerated women in intimate places. Maria swallowed hard, listening, every nerve on alert. Sophie handed her a small recorder. "Record when you can. Keep everything. We'll back you up." It felt like a lifeline, but it also meant immediate danger. Retaliation inside prison was real. In Michigan, for example, women who reported abuse in the Nunn v. Michigan Department of Corrections class action suit said they were punished, placed in isolation, denied basic privileges, or ignored altogether. Later that night, Maria returned to her bunk. The guard she feared, the one she'd seen hanging around too often past her door, but he didn't knock. That lack of a knock felt like a warning. She clicked on the recorder, whispering details into it, the guard's name, times he appeared, how he had spoken to her. She paused, voice trembling. She was terrified he'd find out. Over the next few days, more women came forward. One was a young first-time prisoner, barely 20, who'd been repeatedly coerced into secluded meetings under the guise of special work assignments inside the prison. Another was older, soft-spoken, her voice cracking as she described how she felt manipulated. Her entire diet and privileges hinged on her compliance. Sophie's team advised that they needed more external evidence, medical reports, complaints, maybe even legal help. But as they mapped it all out, the group discovered a deeply entrenched pattern. Prisons simply weren't built to protect women from the very people who held power over them. As All Too Familiar made clear, many internal grievance procedures were basically a facade. Women had to confront the accused before they could file a formal complaint, a setup that exposed them to retaliation. In more than one facility, the report noted, the investigating officers ended up being the same people under investigation. One night, as Maria lay trembling in her bunk, she realized something grim. There was no easy way out. Even if they won, Even if staff were prosecuted, it wouldn't erase the trauma. And inside, the fear of being found out, of being punished for speaking up, was real and looming. Then, the biggest bombshell dropped. Sophie's folder, already thick, grew heavier. She showed Maria internal prison emails that detailed unusual staff transfers, special assignments, and unexplained resignations. One name stood out: Sergeant Ormond, suspected by several women of pressuring inmates into sexual acts. According to one report, this same Ormond had repeatedly coerced a woman named Nilda Palacios into meetings, even after she requested a transfer. Maria's heart pounded when Sophie told her, "He is under investigation, but he hasn't been charged with what you're describing." Even more chilling, she detracked call logs showing he had contacted Palacios after her release, exchanged explicit messages, even images. The Guardian: despite the sustained abuse, Ormond never faced criminal charges. He pleaded no contest to a misdemeanor and quietly resigned. Maria closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. Sophie's eyes met hers. "If we go through with this, it will get messy," she said softly. "But if no one stops it, no one ever will." That night, Maria made a choice. She would risk everything. Days later, prison officials called her in. But this wasn't a pat-down. It was an interrogation. 2 guards accompanied Sophie. Maria clutched her folder in her trembling hands. Her chest felt tight, her voice low, but she answered every question with honesty. They told her she was being placed on protective status. No one said it, but she knew it was retaliation. She would be monitored more closely, her movements logged, her actions scrutinized. As she was escorted back to her block, her mind raced. What she and the other women had uncovered was explosive. If it went public, it could unravel the entire corrupt chain. The transfers, the resignations, the abuses. But inside those walls, she already felt the consequences closing in. And then, in the final moments of the chapter, Sophie handed Maria one more document: a letter from the Department of Justice. It named a federal investigation into FCI Dublin, citing credible allegations of staff sexual misconduct. Maria's breath caught. She stared at the letter as her escort receded into the flickering corridor lights, feeling the weight of what she'd done, but also knowing the risk had only just begun. The day Maria was moved into the protective custody unit, she knew something had shifted, not just around her, but inside the entire prison. Guards who once smirked and swaggered now walked with stiff shoulders. Doors that once swung freely now slammed with controlled force. An uncomfortable tension hung in the air, thick enough to taste. Word had spread. A federal investigation wasn't just a rumor anymore, it was happening. Weeks passed in a strange limbo. Sophie visited whenever she could, though her meetings were now monitored more heavily. Maria sensed the prison administration tightening its grip, like an animal backed into a corner. And cornered animals were the most dangerous. Still, evidence kept building. More women stepped forward quietly, carefully offering testimonies that echoed the same harrowing patterns. In the shadows of the legal process, survivors from other women's prisons had also emerged, describing eerily similar abuses that spanned states, leadership changes, and decades. In places like Edna Mahan Correctional Facility in New Jersey, the Department of Justice had already exposed a deeply entrenched culture of sexual misconduct. Investigators connected patterns, interrogated officers, subpoenaed documents, and uncovered years of ignored complaints. It wasn't just FCI Dublin anymore. It was a pattern, a system, a network of negligence and silence that had stretched farther than anyone wanted to admit. One morning, long before sunrise, a guard knocked on Maria's cell door. "Pack your things," he said, eyes unreadable. "You have a court hearing, not just for her," she realized, but for everything. When she stepped into the transport van, she found several other women already shackled inside. Their eyes met hers. Fear, determination, wounds both emotional and physical hiding behind every stare. These were the same women whose whispered statements had become the backbone of the investigation. The courthouse smelled of disinfectant and cold stone, a sharp contrast to the stale air of the prison. Cameras lined the steps, reporters calling out names, asking rapid-fire questions. Maria felt exposed, vulnerable, but Sophie walked beside her, shielding her as best she could. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Former officers sat stiffly in the front rows. Defense attorneys whispered to clients. Prosecutors flipped through thick binders stacked with evidence. And at the center was the judge, neutral, patient, impenetrable. The trial unfolded like a storm. Witness after witness took the stand. A former inmate described a chaplain who used prayer sessions to isolate women before abusing them. Another woman recounted how officers threatened to mess up her paperwork and prolong her sentence if she didn't comply. Some officers denied everything. Others tried to rationalize the system, but very few cracked under the pressure. They admitted that supervisors ignored complaints, that other officers laughed off rumors, that they all knew the grievance process was broken. One said quietly, everyone looked the other way. It was normal. The courtroom gasped. Maria sat through all of it, hands trembling beneath the table. When it was her turn to testify, she stood slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes locked onto her, some sympathetic, some cold, some full of rage. She told the truth. Her testimony was raw, unfiltered. She described the guard who hunted the block at night, the invasive pat-downs, the coercion disguised as favors, the fear, the retaliation. She described slipping notes through cell doors, collecting evidence like fragments of her own survival. At one point, she faltered. Her voice cracked. She forced herself to continue. When she finished, the courtroom fell silent. Even the judge paused before speaking. And in that silence, Maria felt something she hadn't felt in years, not victory, relief, but recognition. Her voice had finally been heard in a world that had always tried to silence her. The trial stretched on for months, and when the verdicts finally came, they rippled through the entire federal prison system. The former warden was sentenced to time in federal prison. Several officers were removed permanently from their positions. Some faced criminal charges. Others were barred from working in corrections ever again. Agencies launched new oversight systems. Policies were rewritten. The press called it one of the largest prison abuse scandals in U.S. history. But the victory was complicated. Not all the abusers were convicted. Not all survivors got closure. Some officers walked free with plea deals. Some cases were dismissed due to insufficient evidence. In one shocking twist, a key officer under investigation, one named in multiple testimonies, resigned quietly and disappeared from public records. His case was closed without charges. Maria learned this from Sophie one afternoon. Months after the trial, the news hit her hard. The women had hoped that by speaking, every guilty officer would be held accountable. But justice, Maria realized, wasn't complete. It was fractured, imperfect. Still, it was a beginning. The day Maria was finally released, she stood outside the prison gates, holding a small plastic bag with her belongings. Sophie waited beside a parked car, waving. As Maria stepped toward her, she felt the weight of the years lift slightly, not fully, but enough to breathe again. Behind her, the gates clanged shut, not with finality, but with defiance, a symbol of everything she survived. As Sophie drove, she told Maria something that stuck with her forever. "Your case is going to change how women's prisons operate," she said. "Your courage started the conversation no one wanted to have." Maria looked out the window, watching the facility shrink behind her. For the first time, she believed it. But 3 months later, in a different women's prison across the country, an anonymous complaint surfaced reporting the same pattern of late-night visits, the same coercion, the same silence. The system had cracked, but it had not broken. And that's the part nobody wants to talk about. If this story shook you, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe, because the truth doesn't hide forever, but it does fight back.